So tonight's event is to help celebrate our new literary exhibition, which is called I Pray You Stay Alive, Writing on the Edge. And that phrase, I pray you stay alive, comes from a letter that Maya Angelou wrote to the writer Larry L. King, which we have on display as part of the exhibit. And the whole idea for this exhibit is really to explore how many of our best writers have personally confronted issues of life and death, and how they've addressed those issues in their writing. And a natural starting point for this topic is the 1918 influenza pandemic and how it affected one of the greatest writers from Texas. Her name was Catherine Ann Porter, and she was a young newspaper reporter when the bodies began piling up in the streets. She became very ill, and she hovered near death for several days. And her boyfriend, who was a U.S. soldier, because World War I was going on at the time, he basically saved her life, helped care for her. And when she finally came out of her sickness, she learned that he had died from the same illness that had almost killed her. And she went on to write this incredible autobiographical story called Pale Horse, Pale Rider. And that's widely considered one of the, perhaps the greatest piece of writing about that pandemic, which ended up killing more than 50 million people worldwide, killed more Americans than World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam all combined. So we have that in the exhibit. From there, another early writer that we feature that I want to just tell you briefly about is somebody named Gertrude Beasley. And it was in 1925 that Gertrude Beasley, who was a very prominent feminist at the time, published this really brutally direct memoir called My First 30 Years. And the book begins with her first memory, which is being held down by her brothers in a barn as they attempted to rape her. Her book was immediately declared obscene. It was banned. All known copies were confiscated and destroyed. There were stories in Texas that any library that had a copy of that book, the rangers would come in and basically take those copies and destroy them right there. And the thing about Gertrude Beasley is, she had a prominent publisher. This was published in Paris, and it was the same publisher Hemingway had. But she disappeared completely after the book came out. She dropped off the radar. And this became one of Texas's greatest literary mysteries for decades. There was a point in the 1980s where Larry McMurtry was reaching out to people to say, do you know anybody who knows anything that happened to Gertrude Beasley? And one of the people that McMurtry contacted was this prominent librarian in Abilene named Alice Sept. And when Alice retired, she became a literary detective. And she ended up spending several years tracking down the story of Gertrude Beasley and discovering what happened to her. And we have the answer in the exhibit because Alice donated her complete research archive for Gertrude Beasley to the Wittliff collections. So when you take a look at the exhibit, you'll find out what happened to Gertrude Beasley, and you'll also see one of the very rare surviving copies of that 1925 edition, which was kindly donated to us. And then among the more contemporary voices in this exhibit includes Sandra Cisneros, who intervened to save a friend who was suffering from violent domestic abuse. And we had the actual letter that friend sent to Sandra after she reached safety, along with the manuscript for Sandra's classic story that she wrote based on that episode, which is called Woman Hollering Creek. The exhibit includes about 20 writers in all, among them the current Texas Poet Laureate, Irene Lara Silva, who wrote a poem for Uvalde that we have on display. I also want to mention the great poet Naomi Shihab Nye, who always speaks to the importance and the power of healing. And we're showcasing the first handwritten draft of her classic poem, Kindness. And so, of all the great writers we featured in the exhibit, we decided to bring these three together tonight for our conversation. And we have their books, wonderful books, courtesy of Venus McGuire in the University Bookstore that are being sold here. Thank you, Venus. And we will have a book signing after the program. So don't miss out on your opportunity to get signed copies. And so I'm going to briefly introduce our guests, and then we'll get on with our conversation. Next to me here is Reyna Grande, the author of 3 highly acclaimed novels, including her latest, A Ballad of Love and Glory, which is a gripping historical novel that takes readers to Texas at the very moment that the U.S. invaded Mexico in 1846. And along with her excellent novels, Reyna is the author of the beloved best-selling memoir, The Distance Between Us, which tells the story of her childhood in Mexico and her journey to the United States, where she beat a lot of long odds to become the first in her family to attend college. This very brave and highly praised book is the focus of many common read selections in schools and cities across the country, bringing entire communities together. And I want to say that for anybody who's read The Distance Between Us and loves it, Reyna's follow-up memoir called A Dream Called Home is just as engaging and beautifully written. So Reyna, welcome to the Wittliff Collections. We're so glad to have you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
And next to Reyna, we have Celeste Bedford Walker, a celebrated playwright from Houston who is the author of more than 40 stage plays. Her works include comedies, mysteries, historical dramas, and more. And among Celeste's major works is her classic play, Camp Logan, which is set in Houston during World War I, and it's based on real-life events. And I want to say that we did a staged reading of that play here at the Wittliff about 5 years ago. We featured Texas State students doing the reading, and it was one of the most moving and incredible nights we've had here at the Wittliff. The students could see really what happened to those African-American soldiers on the streets of Houston in World War I. It's not so different than what can happen today. So, Celeste is the recipient of numerous national awards, and in 2022, she became the first African-American writer to win the highest literary honor in Texas, the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Texas Institute of Letters. We are honored that Celeste's literary papers are at the Wittliff Collections, and we're proud to publish her brand new book, which is in our Wittliff Collections book series with Texas A&M University. That book is called Sassy Mamas, Collected Plays by Celeste Bedford Walker. Celeste, welcome back to the Wittliff Collections. And we also have Dick J. Reavis here tonight. Dick volunteered for the Civil Rights Movement as a teenager in 1965. He later became a prominent anti-war activist. If you see a photo of a guy with a megaphone on the UT campus during those years, it's probably Dick's face behind it. Dick gained a lot of attention, as is well documented in the 600-page FBI dossier that, compiled on him, which we have on display in the exhibit, by the way. Dick eventually became known as a daring investigative reporter and a terrific writer, won several awards. Among them, he won a prestigious Nieman Fellowship at Harvard University, while also acquiring a batch of fake IDs he used in his undercover reporting. Dick is the author of several acclaimed books. He's reported on everything from the Branch Davidian siege in Waco to a revolutionary uprising in southern Mexico to his own near-death encounter. We have Dick's motorcycle jacket he was wearing at the time of that on display. Dick is a major donor to the Wittliff Collections, where we hold his complete literary papers. And we are really pleased that at long last, a career-spanning anthology of Dick's best writing is now published. And it is called Texas Reporter, Texas Radical, the writings of journalist Dick J. Reavis. Dick, welcome to the Wittliff Collections. And so, let's get right into this topic of writing on the edge. Reyna, you've done such an excellent job in your memoirs of really highlighting the inherent drama of everyday life, and that's something that only really the best writers can pull off. And as nuanced and as powerful as your memoirs are in that regard, you also have these incredibly dramatic moments full of danger. And I'm thinking, of course, about when you were in the desert at 9 years old crossing to U.S. Can you just talk about that?
Yeah, so just to give you a little context, my father came to the U.S. when I was 2 years old, and he came back to Mexico when I was 9.5. So I hadn't seen him in a long time, and he was a complete stranger to me. But at first, he wanted to bring my older sister back with him, because she was 13. And then, of course, my father convinced him to, my brother, who was 12, convinced him to also bring him along. And then I had to beg for my father to bring me, but he didn't want to because I was 9.5, and he said, "You're too little to make the border crossing, I'll come back for you." And then I said, "But the last time you left, you were gone for almost 8 years, so I didn't want to be left behind." And I finally convinced him to bring me along. And that's how I ended up on a bus to Tijuana with my father and my brother and my sister. And one of the scariest things that happened, even before we got to the border, was that when we were on the bus to Tijuana, one morning we woke up and my father was not on the bus. And we started crying because we thought that maybe he changed his mind and just left us there in the bus. And so we were freaking out and we were crying, and we asked the driver, "Where's our father?" And he didn't know. And eventually when we got to the next town, my father showed up, and he had to take a taxi because he said the driver left him behind when he got off to get us breakfast. So that was like the first scary thing that happened to us. And then when we got to the border, he set out to find a smuggler to help us on the journey. And we got caught the first 2 times that we tried to cross. We got caught by Border Patrol, and I blame myself for it, because I was small, I couldn't keep up with them. Oftentimes my father had to carry me on his back, and that was the first time I ever got a piggyback ride from my father, was on the border. And then we get caught, we got sent back. And then my father was getting really desperate because he was running out of money. And he also had taken time off from his work, and he kept saying if he didn't get back to his job, he was going to lose his job. So then right before we tried the 3rd time, and the first 2 times we had done it during the day, and then he decided on the 3rd time that we were going to try at night. And he said that if we didn't make it that 3rd time, he was going to send us back to Mexico, back to my grandmother. And so that kind of, raised the stakes for us, because we knew, like, this is it. This is our last chance to try to get across so that we could be with him. And it was in the middle of the night and really dark. We couldn't see anything, so we had to hold hands. And my most vivid memory of that was when the helicopter showed up. And you hear the noise of the helicopter, and we panicked, and we started trying to find a place to hide. And we crawled under some bushes, and I remember a little streak of light from the helicopter fell on my shoe. And I thought, oh no, they saw us, and it's my fault again. And I was wearing white socks, and the smuggler made me take off my socks. But we were hiding there, and the helicopter was circling around. And then after it left, we started running again. And it was a very scary experience, but obviously, I thought about death, and I knew, like, we could die here, right? Because on our 2nd attempt, we found a dead migrant under the bushes. So I knew we could die. But I think for me, at that moment, was this desperation that what was at stake was not so much my life, but it was more about my relationship with my father. Like, I was just so desperate to have a father in my life. And so to me, that was what was at stake at that moment of the border crossing. And that's what made me run as fast as I could and just pray the whole time that we would make it across. So that moment, it stayed with me, because even today, when I hear the sound of a helicopter, it immediately transports me back to that moment when we were under the bushes hiding there from that helicopter.
Thank you for sharing that, Reyna. Celeste, I want to have you talk a bit about your best-known play, Camp Logan, which, as I mentioned, is based on a true story, and it's set in your hometown. Can you tell me how you first came to hear of Camp Logan?
I first came to hear of Camp Logan from people in the community, the elders, my family. My father was in World War II, an uncle in World War II, and my grandfather was in World War I. And he had talked about it. And then there were neighbors. One of the neighbors was the girlfriend of one of the soldiers at Camp Logan. And then, and I found out all of this when I started to do research on the subject. And one of my teachers at the time that the incident happened was a very young boy, and he remembered the soldiers marching through town, and he had a picture with a bullet hole from a Springfield rifle that he had kept all those years as a memento of the incident. So when I wrote Camp Logan, when I first started to research and think about writing Camp Logan, I had already written 2 or 3 contemporary plays. I think Camp Logan was my 3rd or 4th play. And I'd written comedies and musicals, comedy mysteries, I just like to write different things. And I thought, well, I think maybe I will try my hand at a historical novel, because I was interested in history. I had come through the 60s, come of age in the 70s, and so I knew, that I was in the middle of history. I was in the middle of modern history. And I wanted to look back, and because I became very interested in Black American history then. And I just wanted to look back and see some of the things and be acquainted with some of the stories, acquaint myself with some of our stories. And I thought, well, I have a story right here that I've heard all my life, right here in Houston. Whenever we had any kind of racial unrest in the city, the elders would whisper, we don't want to have another Camp Logan. Be careful, we don't want to have another Camp Logan. So I was already familiar with the story. It was almost like a myth, And I decided to do research. I delved deeply into research for about 2 years.
So that's pretty deep, 2 hours.
For about 2 years, I went to Texas Southern University. They had quite a bit of information. And then the Julia Eidson branch of the Houston Public Library had quite a bit of information. And I was fortunate that I was able to get quite a bit of oral information, because many of the people were still living who knew about the incident or had been involved. Like I said, I had talked with a girlfriend of one of the men that was stationed there, and she said he had told her on that night, don't come out. She was very light-skinned, and he had told her, don't come out, because they were going on the hunt for anybody with light skin, anybody that was white. And that was a story she had. And like I said, my school teacher, he had a story. My grandfather, and then some of the neighbors who had lived, in Fourth Ward. That's where it happened. It happened in Fourth Ward, which is Memorial Park now. During that time, as I said, they were still alive, and so I could actually talk to people. I talked to several church women who had invited the men to their church during that time and said that they were such fine, upstanding, clean young men. And so I was able to talk to them and get their viewpoint and their hero worship of the men. They really looked up to him, and so many people in the neighborhood, in the city at that time, really looked up to him and really had a hero worship type of feeling about them. And I was always impressed about the dichotomy of Black men in the military. On the one hand, they pledged to defend the country, and on the other hand, they were always having to defend themselves. So I wanted to explore that, and that's how Camp Logan came about, that exploration of those men. And of course, I put together a composite of characters. You know, none of these men are actually the men in the incident, but you know, I read about some of the men. I was able to get some information on some of the actual men that were involved. And then, you know, as I said, I'd always heard military stories from my father and my uncle and my grandfather, so I was familiar with that military world, and I thought, well, you know, I think I'll try my hand. Now, one of the challenges, though, of course, was that I was female, and they were all male, and I kept trying to find a way to bring a female in the story so that I could tell the story through her eyes. But that chose to be impossible. It seemed that every time I chose a female character, because I thought about bringing in a reporter, because there was a reporter at the time, a black female reporter who had reported on the incident. I tried to tell the story through her eyes. I tried to tell the story through the eyes of a girlfriend, maybe, of one of the men in camp. But it just didn't work, you know. I just had to try to accept the challenge of getting in the shoes of these men and telling their story from their viewpoint. And I've got pretty good response from men who've been in the audience and have seen the play, including my husband. I've gotten pretty good response from them in the way that I handled it. So.
Okay, thank you, Celeste. And Dick, I think you were 19 years old when you left home and joined the civil rights movement. And you wrote a memoir of that experience. And to me, it's a really fascinating book because we're so used to, when we think of the civil rights movement, we look at it through the eyes of the great leaders, the great charismatic leaders, and you were a grunt, basically, and you write from a really grassroots perspective. Can you tell us a bit about what you did in the movement and how you decided to write about it?
And how I decided what?
How you decided to write about it?
Oh, the memoir of the civil rights movement is the only book that I thought I should write someday, even before I became a journalist. Meaning, I think I recognized that it was transformative in my life. This was not popular with my family or with more than 2 or 3 people I knew because it just wasn't done. Those were the days. My job, how do you say, I filled out a form. It's worse than that. I was at a college called Panhandle A&M University, Panhandle A&M College, whose slogan was progress through education. Through was spelled THRU. This was a rodeo school in Oklahoma, just across the border from Texas, and my parents were living in Dumas, Texas at the time, North Amarillo. Anyway, I was there at that rodeo school, and I walked in the student union one day, and here were these bulletins asking for volunteers to work in Alabama and Mississippi that summer. And I thought, that's what I want to do. And there were 3 groups asking. One was the NAACP, which I thought was too conservative. The other was SNCC, which was radical, which I thought was pretty good. But little did I know they weren't taking in whites. What got me, though, was they didn't pay anything. Then there was Dr. King's group. It paid $12 a week, which was enough to buy peanut butter on, and that's pretty much what I lived on. Sometimes we went door to door and just knocked on the doors and said, food, food. But anyway, usually we worked in 2s, 1 black and 1 white. And we went and knocked on doors and tried to get people to go try to register to vote. We knew and they knew that they would not be allowed to register to vote. First of all, Alabama had a bunch of forms and laws about who could vote. One of them was you had to fill out a form that said who your employer was. And you can imagine what would happen to a black person in a small town when they tried to register to vote, and that was on a government form, right? Small town, white folks knew what they were doing. So it was a risk for those people. And we would take them down to the courthouse. It only registered voters 1 or 2 Tuesday afternoons a month. I don't remember which it was. We'd take them down to the courthouse. They would go up, and the registrar would tell them they couldn't vote. And I was used at first as a spy because of my accent. And the important thing I did is I walked in one day and said, listen, my grandmother's out here in the car. She doesn't want to get in a line with us with all these N-word. Is there anything we can do? And they told me, yeah, go around to the door around the corner. Well, we wrote down everything that happened when they denied people registration, which was everybody, and sent it to John Doerr at the Justice Department. And up there, the people lobbied with the government that we needed a Voting Rights Act. I was a grunt. All of us who went. There were like 3 other white people working on the same thing, plus locals. I worked with a guy who was later killed in a car wreck, a black guy, and also with another one who died a couple years ago. We'd go up to the doors, and the guy I worked with most, Charlie Salisbury, would say, you know how it says in the book of Revelation that the last shall be first and the first shall be last? And everybody would say, yeah, we knew that, which I'm sure they had heard it. So then he'd say, well, black folks are going to be able to vote in Alabama. And we want you to go down and try to register, blah, blah, blah. We did that until the Voting Rights Act passed, which would have been in July or August. I got there in May. And when it passed, anybody could walk up and mark their X or sign their name and register to vote. That's all there was to it. You had to be 21. The federal government, on an emergency basis, sent registrars to 13 counties, and mine was one of them. And it put out a notice through the black leadership that started with Civil Service Act number 2504 or something, and a bunch of bureaucracies. And if you read it, it said there are voter registration workers in the basement of the post office around back. So I drew up a leaflet saying that in plain English. And that's when I thought, hey, this writing stuff could be important. And so we did that. And then the Watts riot happened. And I was walking down to the bus station with a $15 check from my father so that I could return to Texas and go back to school. I was at UT by then. When the police picked me up, took me down to the police station, the rumor was going on around when Watts happened that it was going to happen everywhere. Not around the black community, but around the white community. Sheriff Jim Clark and Selma put men with machine guns on the roofs of downtown buildings. They were all getting ready for a race war. And the chief of police asked me, well, what's your movement going to do next? And I said, I don't know, which is the God-honest truth. It was a movement. It wasn't a bureaucracy. I don't know what we're going to do. He said, what are you going to do? I said, I don't know. If you knew, would you tell me? I said, no. Sergeant Johnson, lock him up. That was my first arrest. It was for vagrancy. I went back to Texas. I was not planning to stay, but my dad gave me so much hell that I did. I went to UT, and when the next summer came, I went back. And that vagrancy charge was still hanging over me. And they sentenced me to 6 months at hard labor. I got out on bond, and then every time I turned around, they were arresting me for something. It could have been any. In one place, they raided a farmer's house. They said they were looking for moonshine. What it was a guy we had sent to testify in Washington, D.C. That's why but they raided his house, and I walked in and said, do you have a search warrant? And they arrested me for interfering with an officer. And then when we got to trial, the charge was changed to disturbing the peace. And when my lawyer was arrested. So I did the questioning of the witnesses. There was only the farmer in his little store at the time, the only black person. He said I didn't disturb his peace. The other people in the store were me and 3 deputies. So I said there was no disturbing the peace. It may have been I disturbed the police officers, but I only asked them if they had a search warrant. Bam, I was guilty anyway. It did not matter what they charged us with. So in '66, my second summer there, I was in and out of jail all the time. That was what happened to most anybody who was a civil rights worker.
Okay. Thank you.
When I talk to people who claim they were in the civil rights movement, I never say it point blank, but I figure out if they were ever jailed or not.
Yeah. Dick, I want to mention that. I want to mention that in the current exhibit, we have a page that shows what the Demopolis Police Department was doing every day. And every single day they did one thing, which was they arrested you, just day after day. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I mean, it's to the point I don't really know how many times I was arrested.
Yeah.
But it was more than 6, and I think less than a dozen. And with trials and appeals and so on, I had to go a bunch of other times. And we had segregated jails in those days. And I made friends with a couple of the white prisoners over time. And one night, 2 or 3 Ku Klux Klansmen was thrown in with us. And when they found out while I was in, they decided to assault me, but my friends held them off. And in time, I won over the Klansmen on at least one issue. But and I was doing the 6 months when one day the jailer walked in with a telegram in his hand. It said the Fifth Circuit Court in New Orleans had declared all vagrancy laws unconstitutional, and they threw me out of jail.
All right, thanks, Dick. And you can see why we thought of Dick for this exhibit, right, in this program, yeah. And that's just one component of his life, but we're going to move on, and I want to ask Reyna about her recent novel. And I want to ask what drew you to want to write about the U.S. war against Mexico, and how did you come up with your character of your protagonist, who was a curandera living in Texas?
Yeah, so I think like many children in the U.S., I didn't learn anything about the Mexican-American War in school. it got skipped over. In my history classes, we spent a lot of time on the Civil War, on the Revolutionary War, a lot of time on the Civil War, and then whatever happened in between there is like nothing really happened. And so I had no idea, right, that this invasion, that the United States had invaded Mexico, and that half of the Mexican territory had been taken. And especially as a Mexican immigrant growing up in California, like I had no idea that California had once belonged to Mexico. And so a lot of times, you know, growing up, I was always made to feel that I didn't belong there, that I didn't have a right to call California home. I was made ashamed about speaking Spanish, that I shouldn't speak Spanish. And so it wasn't until I got to, when I was a junior at the University of California in Santa Cruz, there was a class that interested me. It was a history of Mexico. And I signed up for it. And that was when I learned about the Mexican-American War in a class about Mexican history, whereas it's like, wait, isn't this also like U.S. history? Like, but I had to take a class about Mexican history to learn about it. And it really intrigued me, and I felt it helped me have a different perspective on my identity as a Mexican, as a Spanish speaker. And I say, wait a minute, like, we were here first, and how am I the outsider now? You know, how come now, like when people talk about Mexicans, now we are the invaders? How did that happen, right? When it was the U.S. that invaded Mexico. So that kind of stayed with me for a long time, but I never thought of writing a novel about it, because most of my writing, whether it's, you know, fiction or not, it's always autobiographical in a way. I always find a story within me, like whenever I have the urge to write. But this was in 2013, somebody told me the story about the St. Patrick's Battalion. And that was when I got intrigued. And when they told me about the St. Patrick's Battalion, I don't know if you guys are familiar with them, but this was a unit in the Mexican army composed of deserters from the U.S. Army, and most of them were Irish. And its leader, John Riley, was an Irishman from County Galway. And they told me the story, and I was really intrigued, and I said, well, why did this Irishman risk their lives, deserting the U.S. Army, switching sides to fight for Mexico, and then 50 of them ended up getting hanged by the U.S. Army? So I was very intrigued, and I started to research the St. Patrick's Battalion. I started to learn a lot about John Riley, and that's what hooked me. And then I realized I hardly know anything about this moment in history, and the way I'm going to learn about it is by writing about it. And so I set out to write the novel as a way to teach myself the history that I hadn't been taught. And I spent about 7 years with the novel, working on it on and off, and it was very challenging because unlike you know, you had some exposure to like military life. I knew nothing about, you know, military life, and here I am trying to write about from the point of view of a soldier, and it was so difficult to write, like having to learn. I read so many books, not just about the war, but also like about the military, about cannons, and like learning everything about that to really capture authentically like that point of view. And then I had to research a lot about Ireland too, right? The Irish history. And one of the things that really shocked me, but that also helped to connect me to that character, was how similar the Irish immigrant experience was to the Latino immigrant experience. And nowadays we look at Irish Americans as part of the mainstream, you know, benefiting from white privilege. But in the 19th century, they were severely mistreated and they were discriminated. You know, they suffered a lot of ethnic discrimination, religious discrimination. And so I felt very connected to these, the members of the St. Patrick's Battalion, especially John Riley. Like, I understood his immigrant trauma because I myself had experienced something similar. So that's what gave me that in to that character. But with the other character, with my Mexican character, Jimena, who she's from a family from San Antonio who participated in the Texas Rebellion, and she ends up becoming an army nurse and helping, you know, Mexico defend itself against the U.S. With her, she actually gave me more trouble than John Riley.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like John Riley, I could write his chapters very easily. I really was able to tap into the way like he saw the world. And with her, I struggled very much to connect with her. But what finally like helped me to connect was that that she's a healer, you know, a Mexican, a curandera, and my grandmother was a curandera. And so I try to channel like my grandmother and her wisdom and like everything she knew about like medicinal plants, and that's how I started to connect more with the character of Jimena. And one of my favorite things about writing that book was her the scenes that I write between her and her grandmother, when her grandmother's training her about curanderismo, because when I lived with my grandmother, my favorite memories of my grandmother is when she would give me spiritual cleansings. And I just felt so much love for my grandmother whenever she would give me a cleansing and take care of me. And when I immigrated and I came to live here with my father, I lost my relationship with my grandmother. I hardly ever saw her once I immigrated. And so whenever I wrote scenes between Jimena and her grandmother, I felt my grandmother was talking to me, and that these are the things my grandmother might have taught me if I had stayed in Mexico, that I would have learned all of these things from my grandma.
Oh, very nice. Thank you, Reyna. And Celeste, I want to take you back to this terrific essay you wrote a couple of years ago, which is about George Floyd in your neighborhood in Houston. And I was just wondering, can you talk a bit about growing up in the Third Ward and the social connection you have to George Floyd? And maybe you could even talk about some of what you and others are doing to commemorate him and others.
Well, I think they just had, I wasn't there, had a commemoration for him at a park in Houston called the Tom Bass Park. They put up a statue to him, and they put up area in the park where people could gather. It's kind of like a reconciliation type setting where different people, children, could gather and talk, people with differences. So she wanted to, the person who sponsored this, she wanted to make something, his family wanted to make something positive come out of this tragedy. So he was born in Third Ward. Well, he wasn't born in Third Ward. I think he was born in South Carolina, but his parents, his mother moved to Third Ward, Houston, as we call it, where I'm from. And he was raised in the CUNY Home Housing Project. And I was raised in the CUNY Home Housing Project, about a generation apart. So it just seemed like we were crisscrossing, you know, each other. When I read about, you know, where he had come from, that he had come from Third Ward, I didn't know it initially, but the more I found out about him, the closer it seemed that, you know, he was to my life. We were raised in the same projects. They drew murals on the walls at a store that I used to go to all the time, never, when I was a child growing up, never thinking, that people would be coming from miles around a year or so after he died. They still come. From miles around, they come to this grocery store. It's called Lim Hims, and they have a big mural of George Floyd. He also played on the same football team, championship football team at Jack Yates. He went to Jack Yates. I went to Jack Yates. My son went to Jack Yates, and they both played on the same team together. And his mother is buried just plots away from where my mother is buried. So that's what fueled the essay that I wrote about him at that time, because it just seemed, it seemed like I should have known him, that I could have run into him at any time, because we were just, that close, but yet I never had met him. And I even have a picture of him in my house with my son on the championship football team that they were both on. So it's eerie.
And I love how your essay takes us through your own childhood and the Third Ward, and just the way you talk about growing up there.
Winding through the streets of the Third Ward, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Celeste. And, I think we've reached the point where we are ready to take a few questions from the audience.
Yeah, this is a question for Dick Reavis. You said you connected, or at least you managed to find some common ground with those Klansmen in the jail cell on one issue. What was the issue?
I don't understand the question.
You said you
I
found.
know this guy, and he has to repeat everything.
You said you found common ground with the Klansmen in the jail cell.
Oh, the county I was in, Marengo County, was dry. Everybody know what that was? You could not have. The possession of alcohol was illegal, no matter where it came from. And the sheriff's office used this to run protection on, how do you say it? The sheriff's office ran protection on bootleggers, moonshiners. They came across the street from the house where I live every Tuesday to get their little payment. And they arrested everybody they could for possession of alcohol. Well, the mayor of Demopolis, the town I was in, and some of his cronies decided they wanted to start a country club. But you can't have a country club without alcohol. So they decided we needed to vote wet. And they gave to somebody on the black side of town a bunch of petitions calling for an election with the wet-dry issue. And these found their way to us. Now, I'm not sure SCLC would have approved of that, all right, because it was a Christian organization. But we started circulating those petitions because they arrested everybody that way. And when the Klansmen were thrown in with me, one morning we got to talking, and one of them talked about how the mayor hated him. And I said, well, he hates me too. And from that moment on, we were talking. And incidentally, when they were put in, at least one of them was drunk, and he was singing that Merle Haggard song, "Tonight the Bottle Let Me Down." But anyway, I got to telling them about these petitions, and the other white prisoners, including Klansmen, all of whom, I think all but two of them, were there for violating the alcohol law. And the Klansmen got out before I did, and one of them asked me, could he have some of those petitions going out? So on that little issue, we made some headway. And
Great.
And
So
I didn't get beat up in jail.
it's a happy ending.
It was dangerous for white civil rights workers because the jails were segregated.
Yeah.
Right.
And,
And the title of your memoir, we should mention it, is called If White Kids Die.
yeah.
Right. And you want to, a lot of people probably know what that phrase means, but do you want to tell us?
If any of y'all have ever heard of Stokely Carmichael, a SNCC leader in the 60s, very militant. The first influx of white civil rights workers was 1964. I didn't go till 65, and it was SNCC. And he told the gathering of them, here's why we have y'all here. We don't want y'all running the civil rights movement. But we know that if one of y'all gets killed, it's headlines, right? And he said this about 2 or 3 months before Turner, Sweeney, and Goodman were murdered in Mississippi. 2 whites and 1 black. So in effect, what he said to us is, we want you as human shield. If you're there, they're not going to shoot at anybody. And so the title of my book is If White Kids Die, meaning that was the basic reason I had to be there. Black people could have knocked on each other's doors.
Could you say what SNCC stands for?
Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known in the trenches as the non-student violent non-coordinated.
Thank you, Dick. We have another question. Yes.
Yes, hello. I am Charmaine. I'm a student here at Texas State. I am going for a master's degree in creative writing. My question is directed to Ms. Grande. We read your work, The Distance Between Us, for a class here. It was a pleasure. We were inspired by it. So I guess my question is, you detail in the book there are some details about, your father, and I think it was a stepmother, things that happened once you came over. And I mentioned I am a student of fiction, but we dabble into nonfiction as well. And some of the things that come up sometimes, especially with works of nonfiction, is what part of it, what's your story to tell, and how do you do the dance around, especially details that have to do with other people, especially if it's putting them in a different light. I don't know if you're getting where I'm getting at. But what is your caution about that? Because a lot of times you ask people that question and they're like, just do what feels right to you. But what was your experience, especially when you're talking about tricky things?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. I actually didn't think about that when I wrote this book. Like you, I was a fiction major. I never took a creative nonfiction class, and so I didn't really learn about how do you write creative nonfiction, what are the parameters, right, of writing memoir. I didn't know. I came to this memoir from a fiction background, and so I thought, if I'm gonna write memoir, I'm supposed to write the truth and all the truth, right? So I wrote everybody's truth, through my perspective. So I did not know that you could set boundaries when you write, and that, and thinking about how much of other people's truth are you supposed to write about? How do you protect the people that you're writing about and their privacy? So I didn't really think about that too much with this book. And I didn't even know you could change the names of people to protect their privacy. So all the names in this book are the names of those people. My high school boyfriend said he was gonna sue me for writing about him. Anyway, nobody has sued me so far. But I've only learned later, right? When I wrote A Dream Called Home, I started to be a little bit more careful about what am I writing about my siblings? What am I writing about these other people? I did change a few names in my second memoir once I learned that you could do that. and I'm now struggling with that question because now like I've been writing more about my children and my husband, and he said, "Don't write about me," and it's like, I've spent the last 20 years of my life with you. Like, how can I not write about you? Like, that's so hard, right? So I'm really struggling with that too. Like, how do I not write about people who have made such an impact on my life? Like, I don't know how to not do that. And also my children, right? Like, how much can I write about my children without violating their privacy? And like, are they gonna stop talking to me later on once they, they see like the stuff that I'm writing about them? And so it's a dilemma for memoirists about how much you can write and what kind of liberties you can take, and you are gonna piss people off, I mean, like you said, like there were some people that were not happy with you writing your memoir. So I've experienced that a little bit, but not as much. Like my siblings have been very forgiving about the things that I've written about them. And it's something that every memoirist has to grapple with. And I don't have an answer for you. I think ultimately you're gonna have to decide what you're comfortable with and how much, how are you comfortable pissing off people? And if you are, then go for it. And if you're not, then like, what are some ways where you can avoid writing about things that maybe you shouldn't be writing? One thing I did try to do, like especially for my second memoir, Dream Called Home, was making sure that I try to keep the camera on me as much as I could. And what I did write about my siblings was stuff that pertained to me, that affected me, the things that I was writing about. But I wasn't writing beyond that, like to expose, things about them or for, like just for entertainment, for shock value, those kinds of things. So just going through what you're writing about and asking those questions about, do I really need to write about this, or can I take it out without it impacting the story?
Okay, and we have another question here.
Yes, hi. My name is Sarah, and I found this topic really pertinent because I am a lawyer, a writer, and a journalist. So I wanted to ask each of you, and I'm also in training at the program as a writer. So how do Celeste, Reyna, and Dick, each of you very quickly, I know we're pressed for time, how to leverage your writings and your work for greater impact? That one lesson that you can share with me today, with all of us.
How to enrich.
How to leverage your work for the greatest impact socially.
Well, that's a good question. I usually try to put a lot of enrichment in the characters. So is that what you're asking, or you mean the actual story, or are you talking about story, nonfiction, fiction?
So anything that you found helpful,
Right.
like the topmost thing you would like to share.
Right, okay.
I know there are a lot of things.
Well, yeah. You try to, if you're doing something with characters, learn as much as you can about a character, and realize that just like in real life, they can't be full of ease and quiet and non-stressful and have a conflicting story. You do want to have a conflict in your stories. It's no need to write anything if you're not going to have any conflict or tension or stressful situations in it. So that's one thing that I really try to do. I really try to bring in, different dynamics and different viewpoints, especially between people and characters, and see what can come of that. What can we learn? I go in not knowing, so I'm learning too. I'm experiencing and entertaining myself too. And if I get bored, now that is one thing I have learned. And I think that is the main thing. If I get bored, then it's no need to say, oh, but they won't. You know, they'll just skip right over this part and get to that. You know, they'll enjoy it. If I get bored, I really have to let it go.
Celeste, can you just talk a bit about Sassy Mamas?
Oh.
Since we're selling your book that's titled Sassy
okay,
Mamas,
right.
Collected Plays, but just so people know a little bit about what
Well,
Sassy Mamas is.
Sassy Mamas is a play about women over 50 who are empowering their lives. And one of the main ways they're empowering their lives is that they have chosen to have relationships with younger men. They said older men have had relationships with younger women all their lives, so why should they have all the fun? Now, these women are very accomplished. They're very highly functioning, efficient women. You know, one of the characters is even she was Secretary of State, and then one was a general hospital. She was in charge of a general hospital with a $2 million budget or more, I think. And then one was a trust fund baby. So these are very highly functioning women in different situations. It really is about empowerment. It's not just about what you would typically think, you know, a sugar mama with a younger man, although, you know, you do have to, you're obligated to have some of that in there. But they're with younger men for different reasons, and the women just love it. I mean, they just stand around the block for this play. And the men too. But they were with these 3 different men for 3 different reasons. One had never been married, so he was really the first love of her life, and he often felt like he was older than she was, you know. And then one, she really was in it for, you know, the fun of it. And then one was in it because she was divorced now, and she was alone, and her kids were all grown and gone. And when she had the motto of saying, when I was younger, I did everything for everybody else. Now that I'm older, I just please myself. So she's in it for companionship and just somebody to, you know, to do things with her that her husband or family never did with her. So that's what Sassy Mamas is about, and has a lot of laughs in it. Oh, well, one, yeah, she had lost her husband. Yeah, that was her way of expressing her grief. She was grieving, and she came to the conclusion that, you know, sometimes it's just best, you know, to be alone. So that's Sassy Mamas, and it's a lot of fun, and the women really, really, really enjoy it.
Okay, great. And do you guys want to just take a quick shot at the question, and then we may have time for one more after that? Is that okay? So do you want to repeat your question at this point? Are you okay with that?
Yes. So my interests are in gender, crime, and policy, which goes to, and I've had near-death experiences myself. So my question is how to leverage your work for the greatest impact, and what you can share with someone who works in these areas that you found helpful, both of you.
Yeah, maybe you want to answer that?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So how to create the greatest impact with the work you do?
The greatest what?
The greatest impact,
I-
like the
look,
greatest change.
I wrote, with the exception of the civil rights book, I would say I wrote what I was interested in. I wasn't concerned with its impact, or if it had any. I was just trying to tell stories that interested me. And left-wing as I am, I would guess that most of the readers who liked me were right-wingers. And I grew up in a newspaper family, and I knew that propaganda doesn't work. Mm-hmm. So I just found things that interest me and documented the details about them. And I had a good time doing it.
Okay.
That's why I wrote that stuff.
Okay, thanks, Jake. Reyna?
I agree with that too, because as a writer, I mean, you really don't know where your book is going to end up, and you don't really know if it's going to make an impact or not, you know, so you can't write from that place where you say, oh, I'm going to write a book and it's going to change the world. Like, you write a book that's about something that really like speaks to you, that you want to know more about, that will help you understand yourself. And then when the book comes out, you know, sometimes there's a book that comes out and it really does make a difference. Like, people hear about it, they read it, it changes them. And other times it takes a long time for a book to do that. You know, like when The Distance came out, I think the first year it came out, it sold like 5,000 copies because hardly anybody heard about it. But through the years, like word of mouth and teachers using it in the classroom, like I'm always getting emails from students who read the book and say, oh, your book changed my life, or it helped, oh, it opened my eyes to something, or I connected so much, it helped me to understand my parents. And that's when I see like, oh my God, like my book is making an impact, right? But for me, like it was like, I didn't set out to write a book that was gonna do that. It was more about, you know, I wanna write about this book because I have all this, the trauma of immigration that I wanna explore so that I could understand why I lived through these things and understand like the politics and the society in which I was growing up, and my family and culture and how all of that impacted things. And then that's where it came from, that desire. So I agree with Dick, you know, focus more on like what are the things that are speaking to you and what are you learning from writing about those things.
Thank you.
Thanks, Reyna. And so we have our final question, Tammy.
Quick question. My name is Tammy Gonzalez. I'm program coordinator at the Center for the Study of the Southwest here at Texas State. And I wanted to first thank each of you for being here today and sharing your stories. My question is for Reyna. You said that your siblings have been quite forgiving. So was there an opportunity for your family was there a conversation about what was being written? Did they get a manuscript before it went to print, or did they just get it when it came out?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. When I was writing The Distance Between Us, I would talk to my siblings about the book, you know, because I interviewed them separately. And I got their memories to fill in the gaps in my memory. And so they knew from the very beginning that I was working on this book, and they contributed a lot to the book by sharing their memories with me. And then I would print out some chapters, send it to them so that they could read it. So when the book came out, they knew what was in the book. We had talked about it. With A Dream Calls Home, I went through a similar process, especially with my sister Mago. I would share chapters, and I did ask for her permission because in that book I write about a moment when she left her husband, and I knew that was a very, you know, personal thing. And I asked her, hey, are you okay with me writing about when you left your husband? And I sent her the chapter, and then she sent it back, and she had rewritten a lot of it. But I got her approval, and I put that in the book. So it to me, like, that was one of the beautiful parts of the process, was being able to have these conversations, right, with my siblings, and to remember those moments that we had gone through and how they impacted us. And then, of course, the surprise that we each remembered them differently, too. So that was kind of interesting, that our memories varied in detail and in how things happen. And so I think for me, that was an important process, and important in like getting their blessing, you know, for the book. The ones that got pissed at me were, like, for example, my aunts. They were very angry when they read the book about things I had written about my paternal grandmother, who had been very, very cruel to us when we lived with her. And she passed away a long time ago, and my aunt said, why couldn't I let her be? You know, why did I have to write these things about her and disrespect her memory? And so those were some of the things that I did deal with when the book came out.
Thank you, Reyna, and thank you for those great questions. And So the books that you have an opportunity to buy tonight, we have Reyna's The Distance Between Us, A Dream Called Home, and her novel, A Ballad of Love and Glory. For Celeste, we have Sassy Mamas, Collected Plays. And for Dick, we have his career-spanning anthology, Texas Reporter, Texas Radical. And so you have an opportunity to have all these books signed. Bookstore is selling them right over here. Thank you for attending tonight. We're going to take our writers over here to the book signing table. Thank you so much. We appreciate you.
Thank you.